Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending on your location. Thank you all for participating in this event. I would like to start with a number of observations, and at the outset, let me be very direct, very frank. If there is an agreement reached along the lines described in the White House press release from last month, I think it will be perhaps one of the greatest U.S. foreign policy failures in the last half century. It will be historic, but historic in that regard. It will be a historic mistake. When you hear the advocates talk about the agreement being a historic diplomatic breakthrough, think historic blunder. I say if an agreement is reached because there are apparently still a number of significant differences, even on issues that the United States has claimed to be agreed. The Supreme Leader's description of the White House press release and fact sheet as a lie would seem to indicate that there are at least a few barriers, and these deal not with the details, but with the fundamentals of the agreement, including the timing for the relief of sanctions, the future of the facility at Fordo, deeply underground and heavily protected facility, and of course verification. And verification would be key to the success of any agreement. My guess is there will be an agreement because the P5+1, led by the United States, will grant even more concessions in the final days in the end game of the negotiations. This is the pattern, and there is absolutely no reason to believe that that pattern will change. So let me just give you four general observations before taking questions and comments. The first is that the basic premise of the agreement is fundamentally flawed. The agreement, despite multiple UN Security Council resolutions demanding that Iran suspend all enrichment and reprocessing activities, nevertheless provides Iran with a large-scale operational enrichment infrastructure for breakout. As such, the agreement recognizes Iran as a nuclear weapons threshold state. We can say many things to the contrary, but those are the facts. It does recognize, it does accept Iran as a nuclear weapons threshold state, and other countries in the region and outside of the region will see that for what it is. Also flawed is this notion of extending the breakout time from 2 months to 12 months. We don't know when the clock will start. We have a very bad record with regard to other countries in this context, whether it's Pakistan or India or North Korea or even Russia and China in earlier years. Also, even if you could stipulate that we will know when that clock starts, what are we going to do in 12 months? It's taken us over 12 years to get where we are today. So now we're going to do in 12 years, in 12 months, what we did in 12 years. I seriously doubt that. And there will be even greater resistance to taking any firm action at that point, given the fact that Russia, China, and even other members of the P5+1 will be more heavily invested in dealing with Iran on a commercial and political level. Also, we don't know where the baseline is for that 12 months. Iran has never come clean on the military activities or the potential or possible military activities that have been identified by the IAEA. A dozen of these activities that suggest experience in weaponization. Iran will promise yet again to come clean on these activities, but why would we believe that given their record of obfuscation in the past on this? And finally, there are gaps in the agreement that also undermine our ability to understand where that baseline is. David Albright recently published a piece, for example, that says that the agreement is silent on a key issue, that key issue being the 20% enriched uranium that already exists in oxide form and that is easily reversible. Will that material be placed outside of the country? Will it be further blended down? The agreement is silent on that. And so that gap, along with others, I think are highly problematic in the context of really having confidence in extending the breakout time. Second observation is that the agreement is unverifiable, or will be unverifiable. Iran, over the past 12 plus years, actually 20 plus years, has demonstrated that it is a master of denial and deception in the context of its nuclear program. Iran will agree, apparently, according to the fact sheet, to the additional protocol, plus other measures that will help with transparency. But we are a long, long way from the ability to investigate covert activities, a long way from unfettered, anywhere, anytime, anyplace access to facilities, to people, and to documents. And that's what's required for effective verification in this context. The Supreme Leader has been very clear that the investigators, that the IAEA and others will not have access to national security sites, including sites such as Parchin, where a number of activities have occurred related to nuclear weapons development. Given that the Supreme Leader has said that, and with all due respect to our own leaders, I've got to put more confidence or credibility or weight in what he says as opposed to what someone like our Secretary of Energy is apparently saying. Third, the agreement will not be easily reversible. This notion of snap-back sanctions is illusory. It simply it's aspirational on the part of the P5+1. It will not, if previous experience is any guide, hold when Iran does fail to meet its commitments. And finally, and I think this is fundamental, we have to look at the consequences of this agreement if it is signed consistent with what the fact sheet has told us. And remember, it's not going to get any better than the fact sheet. It can only get worse, and it probably will get worse. But even if one stipulated that we will have an agreement along the lines of the fact sheet, what are the consequences? Well, I think one clear consequence is more proliferation in the region. The Gulf states and Saudi Arabia explicitly has said that it will want to have the same capability as Iran. So it will want to have a large-scale enrichment capability. And one can speculate that they probably want to be in a position to have a breakout capability, just like Iran will have a breakout capability. And so the proliferation consequences are really quite fundamental, and not just in the region, but I think this is a threat to the overall NPT regime and has to be looked at as such. Second, there are the strategic consequences in the region itself, because I think Iran will be left as the key player in the region, the predominant presence in the region, particularly with the U.S. withdrawal from Iraq and the drawdown in Afghanistan. And we have to remember that Iran has a very aggressive, a very ambitious agenda in the region. Not only is it, I think Condi Rice had it right, the central banker for international terrorism, it's also fomenting change and disruptive activities in Syria with its support of Assad, in Lebanon, in Iraq, and now most recently in Yemen. And finally, in terms of consequences, I think that the mullahs in Iran, if they have an agreement along these lines, will feel confident. Will feel confident that there won't be any intervention as it cracks down, as it crushes any domestic opposition in the future. And I think it's really the domestic opposition that is the key here, because the domestic opposition leading to change of regime from within, not imposed from outside, but from within, is really the ultimate and only solution to the nuclear problem. What we need is a secular, is a non-nuclear, democratic Iran, and only in that context will we have a resolution, a real resolution of the nuclear threat. So with that, I'm happy to take your comments and your observations.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Robert Joseph, for attending our online question and answer today on the issue of nuclear program of the Iranian regime. We have received a number of questions. The first question is from the Kuwaiti daily As-Siyaseh, that it is asking to what level of credibility would you give for a possible agreement between the 5+1 countries and the Iranian regime?
Well, everybody wants a diplomatic solution, a negotiated solution. I think that is a widely held objective. I would hope that we could have a diplomatic solution, but it has to be a good agreement. Even President Obama has said repeatedly, a bad agreement is worse than no agreement. But today we're headed toward a bad agreement. And so I think the credibility of that agreement is very much in doubt. If, for example, and this is just one example, the agreement is not verifiable, does not allow the investigation, effective investigation of suspect sites, Iran will cheat. Iran has a record of cheating. As one of my colleagues said quite recently, if Iran today doesn't have a covert nuclear activity or program, it will be the first time in 20 years. We have to have effective verification, and yet we won't. We won't have it if, in fact, the Supreme Leader has said that national security sites will be off limits. Because if they're off limits, guess where the cheating will be? So I think the overall credibility of the agreement that we're negotiating is very low.
Thank you very much. There is another question from As-Siyaseh Daily. The question is, President Obama has just recently described the Iranian regime as a state sponsor of terrorism. Why, in this case, U.S. continues to capitalize on reaching an agreement or having negotiations with this regime?
Well, that's a very good question. And there's no question about Iran being a state sponsor of terror, a major state sponsor of terror, perhaps the greatest state sponsor of terrorism in the world today. And you see it not just in the region, but well outside the region. But the idea here is, if in fact, through negotiations, we can achieve a real end to the threat of a nuclear weapons program in Iran, we should do that. Having negotiated with Colonel Gaddafi's regime personally, I can tell you that these regimes are abhorrent in many respects. First and foremost, in terms of their own brutal repression of their own people. But if we can negotiate an end, a real end, with a good agreement, to rid ourselves of a nuclear weapons threat from Iran, I think that would be a good thing. The problem here is that we're going to have a bad agreement. We're going to have an agreement that allows Iran to have a breakout capability to pursue nuclear weapons. And this will make things worse. It will only embolden the type of behavior that we've seen with regard to sponsoring terrorism, with regard to the aggression in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, and in Yemen.
Another question from As-Siyaseh Daily is, The Iranian regime has threatened that will drop out of the negotiations. Do you think actually the Iranian regime would do that?
I think the Iranian regime is very good at negotiations. They take it to the breaking point, they get concessions, and then they ask for more. I mean, we have seen concession after concession after concession, whether it's exempting ballistic missiles from this agreement or whether it's going from zero enrichment to 1,000 to 2,000 to 4,000 to 6,000 centrifuges. There's been concession after concession. And I think there is no reason for the regime to pull out. But at the same time, you know, the internal dynamics in the regime do raise the question as to whether or not the regime can take yes for an answer. As odd as that sounds, I think we're going to give the answer yes to whatever they demand. The question is, can they take yes for an answer? And to me, that's not entirely clear. I think they will. I think they will because the sanctions have had a negative impact on the economy, a significant impact. But I think there is still a question there.
We have received a question from German national daily Die Welt. The question is, what would be markers for a credible monitoring of the Iranian regime nuclear program in your view?
Well, I think, like we had in Libya, we need to have not just effective monitoring of declared facilities by the IAEA. The IAEA does a great job. I think there are some positive things that are reflected in the White House statement with regard to the additional protocol plus other measures. But those are monitoring measures. What we need to do is to have effective verification. And for effective verification, one needs, particularly in the context of Iran, that has demonstrated over and over again its willingness to cheat on these agreements, we need to have unfettered, anywhere, anytime access to facilities, to people, and to documentation. That's the only way we can have confidence in our ability to verify. And we are not going to get there, according to the Supreme Leader, who has barred any inspections of national security sites.
Another question from German National Daily Die Welt is, how do you read the IRGC's recent declarations of support for the nuclear talks?
Well, I think that is an indication that Iran has achieved everything it wants to achieve in these negotiations. There has been no compromise, at least that I see, in the context of this White House fact sheet. Iran has received everything that it needs, everything that it wants. Now, it still may ask for more, but I think that the Supreme Leader has suggested that this agreement will go forward as long as it's on Iran's terms. I mentioned verification. That's also with regard to sanctions relief. The Supreme Leader said that, sanctions must be relieved all at once at the outset of this agreement. That's different from what the White House has been saying and what the other members of the P5+1 have been saying. But if Iran gets complete relief from sanctions, that will be a big boost to its economy. That will help solidify the support for the regime. And that's important to the Supreme Leader and other members of the regime. Including the Revolutionary Guards.
Yes, thank you. We have a question from Musanna Al-Chadirchi is from the Kuwaiti website Dasman News. The question is, do you think recent threats by U.S. regarding military attacks against the Iranian regime are serious?
I'm not aware of any military threats or threats of military action against Iran. I know there have been some issues about freedom of navigation in the Straits, but there is no credible or serious threat about using force if in fact there is no agreement signed. I don't see anything there, which I think is one of the reasons that Iran has been so emboldened in pushing for more and more, because there is no credibility in the U.S. use of force in this context. We say it's still on the table, but I think it fell off the table a long time ago.
Thank you. Mrs. Mona Al-Jabouri from Iraqi news website Ketabat asks, do you think we really can force the Iranian regime to implement what it is going to be agreed in any possible agreement?
Well, I think that for the most part, and again, we don't know what the final agreement is, but if it's along the lines as the White House fact sheet describes, and if it doesn't include verification or monitoring or inspections at national security sites, as the Supreme Leader has said, and if it does include, as the Supreme Leader has demanded, the immediate relief of all sanctions, will Iran observe its commitments? Well, I think it may for days or for weeks, but I think as this extends into months, the regime won't be able to help itself. I think it will think that it can continue its weapons design, its other weapons-related activities. It will stiff-arm the IAEA, despite yet another promise to coming clean on these potential military dimension activities. But my sense is that they will cheat, and we won't detect it. And if we do detect it, it would be a long process of compliance review. It would be an even longer process of trying to get something done in response, particularly through the international community.
Okay, thank you. Mrs. Mona Al-Jabouri also asks, are you sure of the any positive or consequences for reaching, in case of reaching and final agreement with the Iranian regime? She means the consequences regarding the region, the Middle East region.
Well, again, it depends on if it's a good agreement or a bad agreement. If it's a bad agreement, I think the strategic consequences in the region are profoundly negative. I think it leads to, as I said in my opening comments, more nuclear proliferation. And it leads to a even more emboldened regime in Tehran, with the mullahs being even more aggressive in the region, in promoting what they see as Iran's interests. We see that in Syria and Lebanon, in Iraq, and in Yemen. And I would look for much more of that with a bad agreement. And also, and again, I seem to be alone in striking this chord. The rulers in Iran, I think, consider their own people the first enemy, the most dangerous enemy. And I think they will be confident if there is a bad agreement that allows them to keep a nuclear weapons program, covert, but keep it. They will be much more confident that there won't be outside intervention if they crack down and continue to brutally oppress their own people. This is one of the lessons that I believe the mullahs learned from Gaddafi. Gaddafi gave up his nuclear weapons program, and look what happened to Gaddafi. I think that they see their nuclear program in this context as well.
Mrs. Amal Alawi from Palestinian website Dunya Al-Watan asks, do you think the Iranian regime would ever give up its military dimensions of its nuclear project?
They have shown no indication of doing that. In 2003, according to an unclassified national intelligence estimate that was released in December of 2007, I believe it was, they paused their program. But this is when there was a credible, in the eyes of the mullahs, a credible U.S. Military threat against Iran's nuclear program. The IAEA has made very clear in report after report, particularly in the November 2011 quarterly report, that these activities, these 12 activities, are not just past activities, but there's real concern that they continue into the present. And as long as those facilities in which these activities take place are off limits, I don't think they will ever give those up. And we also don't know how far advanced the weaponization activities were. Perhaps Iran already, I don't know, perhaps they already have a weapons design and the ability to build a warhead for their missiles. And let's remember, they're very, very active on their missile program, short-range missiles, medium-range missiles, and now they're working hard on an ICBM missile. And those missiles make sense, particularly the longer-range missiles, only if there's a nuclear payload. And so my sense is they will continue to work on a weapon as long as they're able to get away with it. As long as they have a bad agreement that allows them to do it, they will continue that activity.
Yes, thank you very much. And we have received a question from Jenny Lowe. What makes the U.S. administration think it can trust Iran to abide by any deal?
Well, I think even the Obama administration will say that they don't rely on trust to verify. My sense is that they are relying on hope, which is not a whole lot different than trust. And hope has never been a very good foundation for arms control or for strategy. But I think that's where we are today. The White House fact sheet talks about a number of steps, very positive steps that Iran will be taking, the additional protocol I mentioned, plus other things that they're doing, greater transparency. These are all good things. They provide for a more robust ability to monitor. But we can't verify. We can't verify, and if there are whole categories of facilities that are exempted. I think President Reagan talked about trust but verify in the context of dealing with the Soviet Union and arms control agreements with the Soviet Union, and specifically with regard to the INF agreement. I have always talked about verify and verify. And in fact, the recent Soviet or Russian violation of the INF treaty goes exactly to that point. We need to be able to verify. Trust is not part of the equation.
Yes, thank you very much. And Mr. Bill Ringel asks, what role you think revelations by the NCRI and MEK have made for the world to know about the Iranian regime's clandestine nuclear program?
Well, I think the revelations by the MEK back in 2002 were very, very important. They served as a wake-up call for all of us, for the entire international community, about this large-scale program that Iran had embarked on, a enrichment program, but also a weaponization program. And I think the subsequent revelations by the MEK and NICRI have played a very important part in our understanding the nature of the program. And it goes to sort of how comfortable, how much confidence we have in our own verification capabilities. The revelations come from within Iran, not from outside Iran, and this is a really hard intelligence target. And, I don't think, unless we have that access that I mentioned, that unfettered, anywhere, anytime access, we can have even low confidence that we're going to be able to identify cheating, let alone deter cheating. I think, in fact, this will be an encouragement to cheating.
Thank you. And Mr. Ringel again asks, given that revelations and also the recent revelations that NCRI made about a secret site in Tehran, Lavizan 3, in February, shouldn't IAEA try to visit this location?
Absolutely. Absolutely, it should. Again, I think that that revelation, like the previous ones, have made a major contribution to our understanding of the program, but also to identify facilities that are clear violations of Iran's existing agreements, its existing IAEA safeguards agreements. Iran has been violating time after time these agreements. And go back to this issue of trust. Why, given that record, given our experience that continues until today, why we would have trust that they would comply with the provisions of the agreement is a question that I would ask anyone, because I can't find any reason to trust. But I hope that the sources within Iran, NCRI, MEK sources, will continue to provide the international community with the knowledge about the activities that are ongoing.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Abdullah Al-Alami from Sula Place asks, if the Iranian regime gets a nuclear bomb, what would happen in the Middle East region?
Well, it's a good question, like the other questions. I think that clearly there would be a cascade of proliferation, not just with Saudi Arabia and perhaps other Gulf countries, but also Turkey and Egypt, and there are other candidates as well. So you would have a very destabilized, a very dangerous security environment, and the internal effect on Iran would also be significant. I think it really would make Iran even more aggressive. It's hard to conceive, but even more aggressive in the region. Because it will think that it can, it can ensure the regime's survival by possessing nuclear weapons. I mean, this is why they value nuclear weapons in the first instance. It does, in their own view, provide for that survival against outside threats and inside threats. So I think the impact of a nuclear-armed Iran would be profound. And I think you would find a real undermining of the entire NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty regime, which has made a major contribution over the course of the last several decades to non-proliferation. I think a bad agreement contributes to proliferation, not to non-proliferation. And that's the irony here. A lot of the motivations of the P5+1, including the Obama administration, is to promote non-proliferation. And a good agreement would do that. A bad agreement promotes proliferation and has exactly the opposite consequences. And I think that's where we're headed.
Yes. Mr. Alami also asks, do you consider the Iranian regime positions in the negotiation as weak or strong?
Well, I think their positions are strong. I think they demand what they want, they receive what they demand, and then they demand more. I think it's the P5+1 who have had weak positions. And this is yet another irony. I mean, the last time I checked, it was the United States that was supposed to be the superpower, and the regime in Tehran, the rogue state. You've got a complete reversal. And I think the explanation is the Obama administration is desperate for an agreement. They want an agreement, even if it's a bad agreement. They say they won't have a bad agreement, but even if it's a bad agreement, because clearly the one that they've described in the White House press release is a bad agreement. Why do they want an agreement so badly, so desperately? I think, you know, I think it's all about legacy.
Yes, thank you. We have received a question from Italian national news agency, ANSA. The question is, if an agreement is reached, what should be the main concern and what should be the main focus of the world community regarding the Iranian regime's nuclear program?
Well, if a agreement is reached, and again, that's another good question, the international community, the world community, I think needs to be very strict in ensuring compliance with that agreement. The problem, as I've pointed out now repeatedly, is that it won't be a verifiable agreement if it's concluded along the lines that we have been told. But the international community, I think, can play a role in insisting on compliance. It can play a role in the phased relief of sanctions, because if everyone rushes to relieve sanctions, all the leverage goes away with regard to implementation of the agreement. The world community is also, I think, important in the context of the greater regional security environment. This is a region of vital interest to the world community, and I think the Security Council and other institutions need to play a role in contributing. I say contributing because I think their influence is limited, but contributing to international security.
The next question that we have received: how real do you think the threats are by Saudi Arabia and others to try to get nukes if the Iranian regime does, for one?
Well, I don't know that I would call it a threat. My sense is that it's almost a promise. Saudi Arabia has stated publicly, or their officials have stated publicly, that they want the same capability as Iran. Now, if the international community sanctions a large-scale enrichment facility capability in Iran, how can the international community deny that to Saudi Arabia? Saudi Arabia has a much better non-proliferation record. Iran has been caught repeatedly cheating on its safeguards agreements and on its other nuclear agreements, including the NPT. Saudi Arabia hasn't. So is this a threat? I think it's almost a certainty that they will want the same capability. They say so, and that they will acquire the same capability. So again, this goes back to, if you have a bad agreement with Iran, and a bad agreement is one that, in my view, that permits enrichment. And remember, the international community, in the context of multiple UN Security Council resolutions, said Iran must suspend all of these activities. Now we've given them the green light, and if we give them the green light, then my sense is Saudi Arabia, for its own protection, for its own national security interests, will move down that same path. Again, I don't find that a threat. I think it's a certainty, and it's understandable. It's understandable that they would do that.
Yes, thank you. The question from Iran News Update news website is, you have indicated that a good agreement would include access to national security sites. Is it possible to think that Iranian regime could ever be compelled to grant such access?
Yes, I do. I think if they didn't have anything to hide, And we had leverage. We had leverage in the context of effective sanctions. And remember, sanctions were having a really profound effect on the economy. We could get that. Look, if a country like Iran makes a strategic decision to give up its nuclear weapons ambitions, we'll know it. And we'll know it because they will provide that type of access. I had an opportunity to participate, in fact, lead the negotiations with the Libyans while those negotiations were secret. We insisted on going anywhere, anytime, any place. And what we found is once the leadership had made that strategic decision to abandon their weapons program, they took us to facilities that we didn't even know about. They provided us with documentation, including documentation on a warhead design that we didn't know they had. Iran hasn't made that strategic decision. That's what we need to force. We need to force it on Iran. So it has to choose. It has to choose between retaining its nuclear weapons program and having a sound economy. So part of it is economic sanctions. Another part of this is having a credible military option. As I said before, I don't think it's credible at this point. We need to make it credible. I don't believe that that's going to happen in the next year and a half, however.
Yes, thank you. The Az-Zaman International newspaper, which is an Iraqi newspaper, Mr. Mustafa Amare from this newspaper asks, what consequences would have a possible agreement with the Iranian regime regarding limiting the Iranian regime activities and involvements in the problems in the region?
Yeah, that's a good question. If I understand it,
yes.
The question is there a possibility of an agreement that could limit Iran's intervention in other states?
I would read it to you again.
Okay.
Yes, it says, if there is an agreement between the U.S. and the Iranian regime, as far as the issues in the region are involved, are concerned, would this agreement limit the Iranian regime's hand in involving in these issues in the region?
Well, we keep talking about an agreement. I think we need to specify, is it a good agreement or a bad agreement? If it's a bad agreement, I think it will have the opposite effect in the region in terms of Iran's behavior. It will embolden the mullahs to be even more aggressive in the region, because they will have triumphed in the negotiations, they will have achieved sanctions relief, and they will continue to have confidence in their own ability to have a nuclear weapon. That will make things worse. If it's a good agreement, if it really does end the nuclear program, then it could have a moderating effect on the regime. But my sense is, we're headed toward the former, not the latter. So I would look for an even more aggressive Iran with an agreement, with a bad agreement.
Okay, thank you. The Arabic daily Ash-Sharq Al-Awsat asks, do you believe that an agreement which we expect in next months between the Iranian regime and the 5+1 countries would prevent the Iranian regime from obtaining a nuclear weapon?
No, I don't. Not if it's an agreement along the lines that have been described.
And again,
the agreement would leave in place this large-scale enrichment capability for breakout. The agreement would not, even though it would say that Iran is obligated to come clean on the weapons activities that have been identified by the IAEA, the agreement would not resolve those issues. The agreement would not have effective verification. The agreement would not deal with the gaps that I have mentioned, like the 20% uranium, enriched uranium that already exists in oxide form. There's no way that this would stop Iran from having a nuclear weapons capability.
Yes, thank you. But this another question also from Ash-Sharq al-Awsat newspaper is Mr. Asama al-Misri asks, in your view, if the nuclear program of the Iranian regime is rolled back, what is your guess? What would be the financial consequences for the Iranian regime? Iranian regime would lose financially regarding this issue.
Well, I think clearly the mullahs have invested a great deal of money, hundreds of millions of dollars at a minimum, in the enrichment infrastructure, as well as the construction of the heavy water reactor at Iraq, which provides for, as you know, a second path, the plutonium path toward a nuclear weapon. Now, this is separate from Bushehr, which has also been, very expensive, but the fuel for Bushehr is now coming from Russia. And in fact, you can take that last fact and you can, I think, extrapolate clearly. Purchasing fuel from abroad for not just one reactor, but for 5 reactors or even 10 reactors is much less money than building this enormous infrastructure for breakout. It's simply not economical on the part of Iran to enrich for so-called peaceful purposes. That whole argument, I think, has been one that has been used to obscure the fact that the real reason that Iran is pursuing enrichment is to produce fissile material for nuclear weapons. The economic argument doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, if that infrastructure went away, would that be an economic loss? Sure, it would be, because they had poured money into a nuclear weapons program, in my view, for enrichment. And remember, the origins of this program, the origins go back to A.Q. Khan and selling sort of the Pakistani design for enrichment. That was all about weapons. That wasn't about a peaceful nuclear program or providing low-enriched uranium for reactors. I think the economic argument really lies with reversing the program and doing away with the enrichment infrastructure and stopping construction of the Iraq reactor.
Thank you. Mr. Abdul Sattar Hatite from Ash-Sharq al-Awsat asks, do you think that Iranian regime and international community will be able to sign a nuclear agreement before the end of June?
Well, my crystal ball isn't any clearer than I think most others. My expectation would be that Iran will continue to put forth demands in the negotiations in this endgame, and will seek to maximize all of the concessions that the West will make, that the P5+1 will make. I wouldn't be surprised if they stopped the clock on midnight of 30 June and continued negotiations beyond that for a time. And I wouldn't be surprised if they have an agreement by 30 June. It, again, goes back to the question of whether Iran can take yes for an answer.
Thank you. We have received a question from Al Arab Al Yom, the Egyptian daily. And the question is, if there is an agreement with the Iranian regime, and if later is found that Iranian regime has cheated in its agreement, what do you think would be the reaction by the US and Western countries?
Good question. Good question. I think that, first of all, it would be very difficult to have an agreement within the international community that Iran had actually violated in a material way the terms of the agreement. I think there will be a number of countries that serve as protectors of the regime in this context and will try to ensure that there is not a consensus reached on this. I think that it would be extremely difficult to get an agreement even within the P5+1. And it's not just Russia and China. I think that the the commercial relations will grow. And I think it's not just Russia and not just China, but also other members of the P5+1 who will have commercial interests in not finding violations of the agreement. But let's just stipulate for a moment that there is consensus, which I don't think we'll have, but let's stipulate that there is. What is the international community likely to do? Well, I mean, the UN Security Council may impose, again, some economic consequences, but again, the reality is such that I don't think that they will. I just think that the violations are likely to be swept under the rug. It's very difficult. It takes years in the U.S. sort of Soviet, now U.S.-Russian context to identify and come to an agreement, and this is just within the U.S. government, on violations of arms control treaties. And then there's usually a period in which the countries go back and forth, and one country will say you're violating, the other country will say no, we're not violating, and that can go on for years. There's just not sort of an effective way of dealing with violations. That's just not. Enforcement is just a real weakness in all of these sorts of agreements.
Yes, thank you. We have received a question from Mr. Patrick Domers. The question is, if you were in Geneva, what would be the issue that you would press the Iranian regime before agreeing to any nuclear deal?
Well, if I were king, I would insist on no enrichment, and I would insist on no Iraq reactor, and I would insist on total verification, effective verification, and resolution of the probable military dimension activities that have been identified by the IAEA. Now, some of you will say that's unrealistic. It's unrealistic to go back to no enrichment. And remember, the multiple Security Council resolutions said complete suspension of all of these activities. So this was the position of the P5+1. It was the position of the EU3. Before that, it was the U.S. position until the joint plan of action was signed in November of 2013. It's only recently that we moved from no enrichment. My experience goes back to the 1980s, and specifically the INF Treaty that was signed in 1987. Prior to that, the Soviet Union had deployed hundreds of SS-20 missiles, intermediate range nuclear force missiles, in the West and in the East. And everyone said, well, we can't insist on zero. We can't insist on zero. We're past that. We can't put the genie back in the bottle. What did President Reagan do? He insisted on zero. To enforce that, the NATO alliance deployed their own INF missiles. And what did the Soviet Union do when we deployed? Well, they walked out of the negotiations for 6 months. They came back. They agreed to zero. Zero is achievable. And so and zero is really the only way to have confidence in the verification scheme. And also, as I mentioned, we need to have effective verification. I've mentioned how we need to do that.
Yes, thank you very much, Ambassador Robert Joseph. We have received a number of other questions, but unfortunately our time is limited. So I would ask you if you have any comments that you would like to add at this ending part of our program. And once again, we appreciate you for attending our question and answer.
Well, let me just thank you for organizing this event. Let me thank all of those who have participated. I think these have been really terrific questions. I just wish I could learn from you as well and get the views that you hold on these issues. Look, the Iran nuclear arrangement is of fundamental importance. It's of fundamental importance to the United States. It's of fundamental importance to the other members of the P5+1, and even more so to the regional states and also more broadly to the international community. We have got to think in terms of good agreements versus bad agreements. The agreement, when it is signed, will be heralded by the governments as a historic breakthrough, a historic sort of diplomatic victory. And that message will be found in the New York Times and in other main media sources. We've got to go beyond that. My view is, if it's anything like what has been suggested will be the outcome of the agreement, it will be a historic mistake. And we have to be scrupulous in our assessments. We have to be objective in our assessments of the faults and failures of this agreement. Otherwise, the strategic consequences of which I spoke are certainly going to unfold, with greater proliferation and greater instability and more aggressive Iranian activities in the region and beyond, including in its support for world terrorism. So with that, I will sign off. I thank you again, and hope that this has been helpful for you and for the participants.